Mason Quinn shuffled into the courtroom, his weathered face betraying years of hardship. The harsh fluorescent lights above seemed to mock the faded military jacket he wore, a symbol of honor now reduced to an ill-fitting garment. In handcuffs, with shoulders slumped and feet dragging, he moved with the stiffness of a man who had lived through far too much pain, far too much loss. His eyes, tired and sunken, were hidden beneath a mop of unkempt gray hair. Despite the dignity once symbolized by his uniform, Mason now stood as a figure far removed from the proud Marine he had once been. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that only a heavy, unspoken tension could bring. The clerk's voice cut through it like a blade. "Name!" Mason's response was slow, trembling, the voice of someone who hadn't spoken much in recent months. "Mason Quinn, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps," he uttered, as if the words themselves weighed 1,000 pounds. There was no gasp from the courtroom, no immediate recognition, but there was a subtle shift. A quiet murmur passed between the spectators. Most couldn't see it, but Judge Olivia Parker, seated at the bench, suddenly froze. The papers before her blurred, the case file slipping from her fingers. A chill ran through her, and her heart skipped a beat. That name struck her like a lightning bolt. Mason Quinn, the very same Marine who had saved her brother's life in the chaos of Fallujah years ago. Her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker, had written about Mason in his final letter home. He had spoken of the selfless act that spared his life under enemy fire. But here he was now, a far cry from the man who once wore his uniform with pride. Now he was a homeless veteran, facing charges for disturbing the peace, trespassing, and resisting arrest. His offenses, it seemed, were nothing more than an unfortunate consequence of the cold, bitter nights he spent searching for warmth behind a cafe. The prosecutor, young and polished, stood to present the case, listing out the charges with a sense of routine. But it was clear Mason was no typical defendant. The courtroom remained tense as Mason shuffled forward. His joints ached, each step a reminder of the pain he had carried for years. He had no defense, no lawyer to represent him, no one to speak for the man who had once risked his life for others. The judge, however, couldn't let this moment pass unnoticed. She glanced down at the case file again, but her thoughts were elsewhere, caught between the past and the present. Who was this man now? And how had the hero she had once heard of, the one who had saved her brother's life, fallen so far? The courtroom held its breath, waiting for the answers. The court was still as a tomb, the air thick with the tension that had settled ever since Mason Quinn entered. His tired eyes scanned the room, unaware of the quiet stirrings in the hearts of those who had begun to feel the weight of his presence. The young prosecutor stood at the podium, flipping through his papers, speaking of charges as though this was any other routine case. But then, something happened, a shift, a ripple in the stillness. "Mason Quinn," the clerk called again, her voice cutting through the room like a sword. The name seemed to hang in the air, lingering longer than necessary. As the words echoed in the courtroom, Judge Olivia Parker froze, her pen fell from her hand, clattering against the desk. She blinked, once, twice, as if trying to rid herself of the fog clouding her mind. A cold rush of memories flooded her thoughts, disorienting her. Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks, and for a moment, it seemed as though the room had blurred around her. Mason Quinn. The name, so familiar, so full of weight, seemed to hit her like a hammer. Her mind raced back to the letters from her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker. He had written about him, this man, this Marine. She remembered reading those words late at night after Jack's funeral. The words Jack had written in his final letter, telling her how Mason had saved his life during that hellish battle in Fallujah. He ran through open fire, through a wall of bullets to get to me. Her brother's voice seemed to echo in her ears, as vivid as it had been then. He pulled me behind cover, and while I begged him to leave me, he wouldn't. Not until he knew everyone else was safe. He said, "No Marine gets left behind while I'm breathing." Olivia closed her eyes, trying to push away the image of her brother, young and full of promise, standing proudly in his Marine uniform, only to be taken from her so violently, so cruelly. And then this man, Mason Quinn, who had saved Jack's life, was here, standing before her in handcuffs, a homeless veteran accused of trespassing and disturbing the peace. The courtroom seemed to spin around her, the faces of the onlookers blurring, as Olivia's heart pounded in her chest. How could this be? How had the man who had once been hailed as a hero, the man who had given his all for his country, fallen so far? It was a question that gnawed at her as she glanced back at Mason. Her hands were trembling, the papers before her now unreadable. She wanted to speak, to call the case to order, but her voice failed her. Instead, she simply stared at the defendant, her thoughts racing. He was so different now. Gone was the confident, disciplined Marine who had once fought alongside her brother. In his place was a frail, worn man, beaten down by life, his once proud uniform now nothing more than a tattered reminder of who he used to be. "Mason Quinn?" Olivia murmured, her voice barely a whisper, too soft for anyone to hear, her breath caught in her throat. The shock was so deep, so overwhelming, she could hardly grasp it. There he was, the man who had saved her brother's life, and now he was here, his life in ruins, and she had to be the one to decide his fate. It felt like a cruel twist of fate, a test she wasn't prepared for. But she couldn't just let this moment slip by, not when she knew the truth of what he had done. Her eyes locked onto Mason's, but she saw only the man who had carried so much pain, so much loss. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't proceed as if this was just another case. There was so much more at stake here, so much more history between them that no one in this room could understand. The prosecutor, unaware of the storm raging inside the judge, continued speaking, his voice mechanical, giving details of the charges Mason faced. But Olivia couldn't hear him. She was lost in her thoughts, in her memories of a brother she had loved and lost, and of a man who had kept his promise, even when it meant risking his life. "Mason Quinn," she said again, this time louder, the words escaping her with an authority she didn't feel. She forced herself to speak, but her voice was thick with emotion. "Do you have representation today?" Mason, still confused and unable to comprehend the turn of events, shook his head. He didn't have a lawyer, he couldn't afford one. The public defender who had been assigned to him was elsewhere, and he was left to face these charges alone. Olivia took a deep breath, steadying herself. The weight of what she knew, what she remembered, pressed down on her, making it hard to think clearly. Her fingers twitched as she looked at the case file before her, but it no longer mattered. This case was no longer just about the law, it was personal. She glanced up, her eyes scanning the courtroom, her gaze falling once again on Mason. He had no idea who she was. How could he? 20 years had passed since that day in Fallujah. She was no longer the young woman who had stood by her brother's side, and he was no longer the Marine who had saved Jack's life. Yet here they were, fate having brought them together in this cold, sterile courtroom. Olivia swallowed hard. This was no ordinary trial. No, this was something much more complicated. She couldn't let him slip through her fingers again. Not this time. She had to find a way to make things right. Mason Quinn had been a soldier once, a Marine, part of a brotherhood forged in the heat of battle. He had stood tall in his uniform, a symbol of strength, discipline, and duty. But the man standing before the courtroom now was nothing like the Marine he had once been. His broad shoulders had once borne the weight of a rifle and the responsibility of his men. But now they sagged under the weight of years of suffering, pain, and loss. His body, once a machine of precision and power, was now ravaged by injuries. The ache in his joints was constant, a reminder of the battles he had fought, both on the front lines and within his own mind. His back was hunched, not just from age, but from the weight of memories that refused to let him go. The mental scars were far deeper than the physical ones. They were invisible, yet they bled through his every thought, every breath. Mason had served 2 tours, one in Iraq, one in Vietnam, and with each tour he had given more of himself. The horrors of war had not left him when the plane touched down on American soil. No, they had followed him home, quietly stalking him in the silence of the night, creeping into his dreams. The sounds of gunfire, the screams of his comrades, the smell of blood and smoke, they never faded. The post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, had slowly eaten away at his sanity, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. At first, Mason had tried to fight it. He had tried to keep going, to carry on like everything was fine. But the weight of the world had become too much. His wife, who had once stood by his side through thick and thin, had eventually walked away. She had tried, but the man she married was no longer there. The man who had returned from war was broken, a stranger to her and to himself. She had left with their children, leaving Mason alone in a house filled with memories, of happier times, of a life he could never get back. The Veterans Affairs, VA benefits, promised to men like him who had served their country, had become a nightmare. The paperwork piled up, the phone calls went unanswered, and the bureaucracy of it all kept him trapped in an endless cycle of waiting and frustration. The disability benefits that were supposed to help him rebuild his life had been delayed, tangled in red tape that only seemed to grow thicker the more he fought. That he had tried to find work, to rebuild his life, but the pain was too great. The nights when the memories overwhelmed him had become more frequent, the days more difficult to endure. Jobs that once seemed like an escape now felt like chains. His body, broken by the years of physical labor, refused to cooperate. Eventually, he had lost his job, and without the stability of a job, his house slipped through his fingers like sand. Foreclosure. The letters came with ruthless regularity, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen. And so, Mason had ended up on the streets. But he wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't looking to cause harm or make a scene. He was just trying to survive. He found refuge behind a cafe, huddled near the dumpster, where the heat from the kitchen exhaust would warm him on the coldest nights. He wasn't panhandling. He wasn't begging for handouts. He was just a man trying to stay warm, trying to escape the gnawing cold that seemed to pierce him to his very soul. The cold was an enemy he couldn't fight. It was relentless, just like the memories. The cafe owner had been kind to him, offering food when he could, not out of charity, but out of kindness. Jimmy, the cook, had known Mason for years. He had been a young boy when Mason had first served in Iraq, but now he was an adult working the kitchen. Jimmy had heard the stories of Mason's bravery, of how he had saved so many of his comrades, including Lieutenant Jack Parker, the very man who had been the cause of this trial. But Mason wasn't the man he used to be. He was a broken man, just trying to get through the day, 1 minute at a time. The prosecutor, with his sharp suit and perfect teeth, stood in front of the judge, listing the charges against Mason. Trespassing, loitering, resisting arrest. As he spoke, Mason's mind drifted. The prosecutor had no idea. He didn't know the man behind the charges. He didn't know the sacrifices Mason had made or the demons he carried. Mason's eyes glanced toward the window, where the cold wind howled outside. It was a reminder of how little control he had over his life. He couldn't change his past. He couldn't undo the things he had done or the people he had lost. He couldn't fix the broken parts of himself, no matter how hard he tried. But he wasn't a criminal. He wasn't some troublemaker. He was just a man who had given everything for his country and had been forgotten in return. His heart ached, not just from the physical pain, but from the weight of the injustice he had suffered. He didn't want pity. He didn't want anyone to feel sorry for him. He just wanted someone to remember him for what he had done, for the man he had once been. He was no longer the Marine who had stood tall, but the man who had fought for his country, for his brothers in arms, and now he was just trying to survive. The courtroom was silent as Mason's gaze drifted back to the judge. He had no idea how this trial would end. But what he did know was this: he wasn't just fighting for warmth anymore. He was fighting for dignity. He was fighting to be remembered. And maybe, just maybe, he was fighting for a chance to live again. The courtroom was thick with the tension of unspoken truths. The prosecutor continued speaking, his words now falling on deaf ears as Mason's mind drifted, lost in the weight of his own thoughts. He had no lawyer. He hadn't asked for one. And in truth, he didn't believe anyone would want to take on his case. His body ached, and his spirit felt even more broken with each passing moment. The harsh fluorescent lights above seemed to magnify his isolation, the emptiness of his existence. This was his life now. The bitter cold, the nights spent in shadow, the courtrooms, and the judgment that followed him wherever he went. Just as Mason braced himself for what would come next, likely a swift, unsympathetic verdict, there was a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The courtroom door creaked open, its sound carrying like a herald of change. All eyes turned toward the figure that entered, the soft tap of his polished shoes breaking through the tension in the room. That a man in an expensive suit stood there, his presence commanding, his face calm and composed. His eyes scanned the courtroom, and in a single, fluid motion, he approached the public defender's table. The man's name wasn't immediately apparent, but his posture, his assuredness, and the briefcase he carried spoke volumes. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Alexander Rossi, for the defendant Mason Quinn." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. It was unheard of, unexpected, and for Mason, standing at the center of it all, it was almost too much to process. He stared at Rossi, confusion painted on his face. He hadn't called anyone. No one had reached out to him. He couldn't afford a lawyer. Who was this man? What was he doing here? "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor," Rossi continued, his voice unflinching. "But I have been retained to represent Mr. Quinn. My firm will be providing pro bono services for him." There it was. The words hit Mason like a wave, washing over him with a mix of disbelief and hope. Pro bono? For him? The judge, Olivia Parker, looked up from her file, her brow furrowing slightly in confusion. It wasn't common for a defendant to receive such unexpected representation, especially when they hadn't requested it. She was about to speak when Rossi spoke again. "I understand this is highly irregular, Your Honor," Rossi said smoothly, glancing briefly at Mason before returning his gaze to the judge. "But I assure you this is a recent development. I kindly request a brief recess so I may confer with my client." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the murmurs rippling through the air like electricity. Olivia Parker, still shaken by her personal connection to the case, took a deep breath and nodded. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," she declared, rising from her seat. Her voice, though steady, betrayed the tension that had built up inside her. As the courtroom emptied, Mason sat frozen in his place, his mind racing. Why was this man here? Why was a lawyer, a stranger, stepping into his life so suddenly? Alexander Rossi, unfazed by the scrutiny of the room, moved to Mason's side. For the first time, Mason felt a flicker of something that felt almost like hope. Rossi's presence felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Mason, unable to mask his confusion, turned to Rossi. "I didn't call you," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I don't have money for a lawyer. I can't afford—" "You don't need money for a lawyer," Rossi interrupted, his tone calm, reassuring. "You're not alone in this, Mason. My firm, Williams, Rossi, and Parker, has decided to handle your case without charge." Mason stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. It didn't make sense. He had been abandoned for so long, ignored by the system that was supposed to help him. The thought of someone, anyone, standing up for him was almost too much to grasp. The lawyer's calm demeanor was in stark contrast to the storm of emotions churning inside Mason. The past few years had been nothing but a fight for survival. He had learned not to trust, not to hope. Yet here was a man, a stranger, offering to help him, offering to fight for him. Rossi's eyes softened, seeing the confusion in Mason's gaze. "You've been through a lot," he said quietly, leaning in just slightly. "I know it's hard to believe, but we're here to make sure you get a fair chance. This isn't just about the charges. It's about making sure you're treated with the dignity and respect you deserve." Mason swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Why? Why are you doing this for me?" The question escaped him before he could stop it. It felt almost ridiculous to ask, but the weight of the words was too great to ignore. Rossi gave a slight smile, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "Because your story matters, Mason, and because people like you, people who've given everything for their country, deserve better than this." For the first time in a long while, Mason felt a tear burn at the corner of his eye, threatening to fall. He blinked it away, quickly, not wanting to show any weakness in front of the stranger. But something deep inside him was stirring. Could it be possible? Could someone, anyone, actually care? As the recess began, Mason stood up, the ache in his body becoming more noticeable as he stretched. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. The courtroom doors swung shut behind him, but in that brief moment, Mason Quinn felt like he might just have a chance at redemption. Judge Olivia Parker sat alone in her chambers, the silence surrounding her almost deafening. The usual calm she maintained while reviewing cases was gone. Her thoughts raced, memories flooding her like a torrential wave. She tried to focus on the papers in front of her, but it was impossible. Her hands trembled as she reached for the drawer of her desk. For years, she had kept the photograph hidden away, tucked beneath stacks of case files. It was an old picture, worn at the edges, the ink fading from repeated glances. She pulled it out carefully, as if afraid it might shatter under her fingers. It was a photo of herself, standing beside her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker. They were both smiling, their eyes filled with hope and youth, the future before them. Her brother had been so full of life, so full of potential. She stared at the photo, her vision blurring with the haze of time. Jack's voice echoed in her mind, his words from his final letter, the letter he had written after Mason Quinn saved his life during the Battle of Fallujah. "He ran across open ground under fire to pull me behind a wall. He said to me, 'No Marine gets left behind while I'm breathing.'" The memory twisted in her chest. The words her brother had written about Mason, those words had haunted her for years. Jack had always spoken with admiration for Mason, the Marine who had risked everything to save him. In that moment, her brother's life had been spared, but Jack's own future had been violently cut short 2 weeks later by an IED. Olivia blinked away the tears threatening to fall, trying to steady herself. But the weight of her brother's death and the years of unanswered questions were too much to bear. After Jack's death, she had tried to find Mason. She reached out to military contacts, to friends who might know where he had gone. But the answers always came back the same. No one knew. The Marine Corps had been tight-lipped about Mason's whereabouts. It was as though the man who had saved her brother had vanished into thin air. Now, here he was, sitting in her courtroom, the man who had risked his life for her brother, the man who had done the impossible. And yet, instead of being honored, he was here, accused of disturbing the peace, struggling to survive on the streets. His life reduced to nothing more than a set of charges. It was a bitter irony, one that made her stomach churn. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and walked to the window. The city stretched out before her, oblivious to the storm raging in her chest. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves outside, but it felt far too still in her mind. How had this happened? How had Mason, the man who had given everything for his country, fallen so far? The injustice of it made her blood boil. The image of her brother's face, smiling in that photograph, flashed before her eyes again. The young, idealistic man who believed that heroes could be recognized. The man who would never have imagined that someone who saved his life would end up homeless and forgotten. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, a surge of anger rising within her. She had always prided herself on her impartiality as a judge. She had built a career around fairness, around the ability to separate her emotions from the law. But this case, it was different. It was personal. Mason Quinn was no longer just a defendant in her courtroom. He was the man who had been a part of her brother's final days, the man who had carried the burden of survival when Jack couldn't. How could she remain neutral when her heart and her duty collided so violently? Olivia pressed her forehead against the cool window, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to find some semblance of balance. But it was impossible. Her connection to this case ran too deep. Her brother's death had been painful enough, but now, seeing Mason, broken, alone, made it all the more unbearable. The courtroom door creaked open, and the voice of her colleague, Alexander Rossi, broke through her reverie. He had come to check on her, to remind her that there were still decisions to be made, rules to follow. But Olivia wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to face the courtroom, to go back to her role as the impartial judge. Her gaze shifted back to the photograph in her hand, the ghost of her brother's smile still etched into her memory. For a moment, she felt something shift inside her. A deep, aching need to right the wrongs, to make Mason's struggle known. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't stay distant. She couldn't let this moment slip away. Her brother's final wish had been for Mason to be remembered. And she, the woman who had tried to keep her brother's memory alive for so long, would make sure Mason Quinn was not forgotten. As she turned to face the door, the weight of her decision settled heavily on her shoulders. This trial was not just about the law anymore. It was about honor. It was about justice. And most importantly, it was about remembering the sacrifices of those who had been left behind. The courtroom was deathly quiet as Mason Quinn stood in the witness box, his eyes fixed on the floor. The weight of the room pressed down on him like a heavy blanket, suffocating him with the memories he had buried so deeply. He had never expected to relive this moment. Not like this, not in front of strangers, not after everything that had happened. But now it was impossible to escape. He had to tell the truth about what happened in Fallujah. The prosecutor had asked him to recount his actions, to explain why he was in that battlefield, under heavy fire, trying to save his fellow Marines. Mason's voice was hoarse as he began speaking, each word like a battle against the memories that tried to rise up and drown him. It was April 17th, 2004. Mason started, his voice shaking slightly. We were escorting a convoy near the western outskirts of Fallujah when we came under fire. The ambush was brutal, fast, like a storm out of nowhere. We hit the ground, all of us scrambling for cover. There was gunfire everywhere, the kind that makes your heart stop. His hands trembled, but he clenched them into fists at his sides, willing himself to stay calm. His breath caught in his throat as the memory unfolded before him. Too vivid, too real. I saw Jack, Lieutenant Parker, Mason continued, his voice now thick with emotion. He was trying to get to a wounded Marine, trying to pull him to safety. But the fire was relentless. The bullets were tearing up the ground around us. And Jack, he didn't even hesitate. He kept moving forward, not thinking about himself, only about the others. Mason paused, taking a shuddering breath as his chest tightened. I couldn't let him go alone. I couldn't let him be another casualty. The courtroom was so still now that Mason could hear his own heartbeat, thumping painfully in his ears. He could feel the weight of the past crushing down on him again, but he had to keep going. He had to finish this. I ran, Mason said, his voice faltering. Under fire across open ground. The bullets were everywhere, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't leave him there. I got to Jack, pulled him behind a wall. He told me to leave him, that he'd be fine, but I wouldn't let him go. Couldn't. I got him to safety, and then his voice cracked, and for a moment he couldn't continue. His throat closed, the weight of the memory choking him. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, heavy and thick, as everyone waited for him to continue. Finally, Mason wiped the back of his hand across his face, his eyes red and raw. He made it to the medevac, Mason whispered. But a few weeks later, I heard he was killed by an IED. I kept thinking, maybe if I hadn't gone for him, maybe he would have been safe. But he wasn't. And He stopped again, unable to speak the words. The guilt was suffocating, drowning him in its enormity. The courtroom held its breath. But then, from the gallery, an unexpected voice broke through the tension. "That's true," the voice said, deep and steady. An older man, silver-haired, stood slowly, his uniform pressed and immaculate despite his years. He looked directly at Mason, his eyes filled with respect and something deeper, something that spoke of shared history. "I was there in the same unit. Staff Sergeant Quinn saved more than just Jack that day. He saved all of us." Mason's eyes widened in surprise as the man continued, his voice unwavering as he added, "We were pinned down, and Mason ran into that hell without a second thought. He pulled Jack to safety and gave covering fire, making sure the rest of us could get out. He didn't think twice. He was the best of us." Mason's heart raced as the silver-haired Marine turned to the judge, his face hard with resolve. The truth is, Mason did more than just his job that day. He put his life on the line for his brothers, and that's something no one can take away. The courtroom was now entirely still, save for the faint shuffling of feet as the weight of the man's words sank in. The silence was deafening, but it was no longer oppressive. There was a sense of awe, of respect, that had not been there before. Mason, still in the witness box, looked at the Marine, his heart pounding in his chest. He could barely believe what he was hearing. For so long, he had carried the guilt, believing that his actions had led to Jack's death. But now, hearing the truth, the validation of his choices was like a floodgate opening inside him. The emotions he had kept locked away for so long began to pour out. But they weren't just filled with guilt anymore. They were also filled with something else, relief, a sense of peace, however fleeting. The judge's voice cut through the moment, sharp and clear. "Thank you, Sergeant. You've added the credibility needed to support Mr. Quinn's account. The court will take this into consideration." Mason nodded slowly, the weight of the testimony still settling over him. It wasn't over yet. The battle wasn't won. But for the first time in years, he felt like he might stand a chance. Not just in the courtroom, but in his own mind, in his own heart. As the silver-haired Marine returned to his seat, Mason gave him a brief, grateful nod. In that moment, for the first time, Mason Quinn didn't feel like he was fighting alone. The courtroom had shifted, the air heavy with anticipation. Judge Olivia Parker, her heart pounding in her chest, stood poised at the bench, her eyes scanning the faces of those gathered. The words she was about to speak could change everything for Mason Quinn, and she knew it. She had spent years burying her personal connection to this case. But now, with the truth of what Mason had done on the battlefield and the injustice he had suffered, she couldn't remain silent any longer. The veil of professionalism had been stripped away, leaving only the raw emotion of what she had witnessed. The truth of who Mason Quinn was had been laid bare. "Mason Quinn," she began, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "You are not just a defendant in this courtroom. You are a man who gave everything for his country, who risked his life to save others. and whose service has been forgotten, lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy and red tape. Her words echoed in the room, and for the first time, Mason felt like someone truly understood the magnitude of his sacrifice. His chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. He had always feared he would be forgotten, that his actions on the battlefield would mean nothing. But now here was someone, a judge no less, recognizing the honor and bravery that had been buried beneath the layers of pain and neglect. Olivia paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She glanced at the Marine who had stood in the gallery, validating Mason's testimony. She could see the respect in the man's eyes, the shared history between them. It was a history Mason had carried alone for far too long. Turning her attention back to Mason, Olivia's voice grew firmer. Today, we make right what has been wrong for far too long. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Mason Quinn, in recognition of your extraordinary courage during the Battle of Fallujah, and in recognition of the lives you saved, it is my duty to inform you that you will be awarded the Navy Cross. A shocked gasp rippled through the courtroom. The Navy Cross. It was second only to the Medal of Honor, and it was being awarded to a man who had been forgotten by the very country he served. Mason's heart skipped a beat as the words sunk in. The Navy Cross. It was something he had never expected, never imagined he would receive. It was the kind of honor reserved for the highest of heroes, the kind of men who saved lives, who fought in the face of death without hesitation. Mason's eyes glistened, but he couldn't speak. His throat was tight, the lump that had formed there too heavy to dislodge. He had never been a man to seek recognition. His only wish had been to survive, to carry the weight of his memories without them crushing him. But now, this recognition, this public acknowledgement of his bravery, felt like a weight being lifted from his soul. The Navy Cross will be presented to you, Judge Parker continued, and in addition, your service record will be reassessed. Your benefits from the Veterans Affairs Department will be reinstated, including full medical coverage, housing allowance, and retroactive disability pay. Mason felt his knees weaken. His benefits. Finally, after years of waiting, of endless phone calls and paperwork that had gone nowhere, would be restored. He would finally have the care he had been denied for so long. But more than that, the recognition that he had been a hero, that his sacrifices had mattered, was something he had never thought possible. His life had been a battle, both on the field and after he returned home. But in this moment, it felt as though the battle had finally been won. Your Honor, Rossi, the lawyer who had stepped in for Mason, said quietly, his voice trembling with emotion. This is everything. Mason nodded, too overcome with emotion to respond. He couldn't believe it. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a place in the world again. He wasn't just a forgotten man, lost in the cracks of a broken system. He wasn't just a homeless veteran facing charges. He was a hero, recognized and honored for what he had done, for the lives he had saved. Judge Parker glanced at Mason one last time, her eyes softening. This court, she said, her voice filled with finality, will stand adjourned. But Mason, you are no longer invisible. You are no longer forgotten. As she brought the gavel down, the room erupted into applause. It was a moment of redemption, of recognition for a man who had been lost to the world for far too long. And for Mason Quinn, it was the first moment in years that he felt truly seen. The courtroom fell into a profound silence as Judge Olivia Parker's gavel slammed down with finality, signaling the end of a long and painful journey. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Mason Quinn stood at the front, his body still, his face a mask of disbelief. For years he had lived in the shadows, hidden behind the weight of his own pain. But now, in this very room, the truth had come to light. His story had been heard. After careful consideration, Judge Parker began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I hereby dismiss all charges against the defendant, Mason Quinn. These charges, disturbing the peace, trespassing, resisting arrest, will be dropped with prejudice. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Mason didn't hear it. He couldn't. The world around him felt distant, like he was floating above it, the words swirling in and out of his consciousness. He had expected nothing from this trial except the cold judgment of the system, but now he stood in the midst of something else entirely, something he had never dreamed possible. The prosecutor, the very man who had presented the case against him, stood in silence. His expression was unreadable for a moment, but then, as if drawn by an invisible force, he slowly nodded in respect. And then, something unexpected happened. The prosecutor, of all people, stood up from his seat, straightening his suit with a subtle sigh, and without a word, he too joined the others who had begun to rise point one by one. The members of the courtroom stood in unison, their eyes fixed on Mason. The bailiff, the stenographer, the witnesses, even the audience, some of whom had been unaware of the depth of Mason's story, stood and gave him the kind of respect only the truly deserving receive. There was no applause, no fanfare, just a moment of quiet reverence. A man who had been forgotten by society for so long now stood at the center of a courtroom that had finally acknowledged him. Mason's knees trembled beneath him, and he gripped the edge of the witness stand for support, but his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to look away. He wanted to hide, but instead, he slowly raised his eyes, meeting the gaze of Judge Parker, who had risen from her seat as well, her face soft with a mixture of sympathy and honor. Mason, she began, her voice surprisingly gentle, breaking the silence. Your service to this country is undeniable, and your sacrifice, what you gave on that battlefield in Fallujah, is something that should have been acknowledged long ago. Mason swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. He had always believed that the military would forget him, that his life and his actions would fade into the ether of time, never to be seen or remembered. But here now Judge Parker was speaking to him not just as a judge, but as a human being who had seen the truth of his struggles. You have carried the burden of guilt for far too long, she continued, her eyes never leaving his. You've shouldered not just the weight of battle, but the weight of a system that failed you. And for that, I am deeply sorry. But I want you to know this, Mason. You are not invisible. Your story will not be forgotten. Not by me, and not by anyone in this room. Mason felt a lump form in his throat, and despite his best efforts, a tear slipped down his weathered cheek. It wasn't just for himself. It was for all the men and women like him who had given everything and then been left behind. The pain he had carried for so long seemed to melt away in the presence of these simple but powerful words. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something that had been long extinguished. Hope. Judge Parker's voice broke through again, clear and firm. Mason Quinn, this court recognizes your bravery, your service, and your sacrifices. It is long overdue, but today, we make sure that your story is heard and that you receive the recognition you deserve. The courtroom remained standing, the collective respect for the man in front of them palpable. The tension that had once clung to the air had been replaced by something far more powerful: honor. And for Mason, it was more than just a legal victory. It was the first step in reclaiming his dignity, in shedding the years of pain and neglect that had marked his existence. Mason opened his mouth, but no words came out. His breath caught as he looked around at the people who had given him the one thing he had lost: respect. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but it was enough. It was enough for the people who had stood in respect for him. And as Judge Parker nodded, a quiet tear slipping down her cheek, she knew that today, justice had not just been served. It had been healed. The day after the trial, Mason Quinn stood at the doorway of his new apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was small, modest even, but it was his. For the first time in years, he felt like he was standing on solid ground. The echo of the courtroom, the respect that had been shown to him, still rang in his ears. The Navy Cross, the reinstated benefits, and most of all, the acknowledgement of his sacrifice, felt surreal, like something that belonged to someone else. But it was real. It was happening to him. The small, one-bedroom apartment was furnished simply, but there was a comfort in its simplicity. The walls were a neutral shade, and a small kitchen sat tucked in the corner, awaiting the day Mason could finally feel like he was truly home again. There were no grand gestures, no luxuries, but for Mason, this was more than enough. This was the beginning of something new to us. He stepped inside. Mason's gaze fell on the small envelope lying on the table. It was official-looking, bearing a familiar seal. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore it open, his eyes scanning the words written inside. The letter was from Judge Parker's brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker. "Mason," it began, and for a moment, Mason thought he must be imagining it. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, know that my sister, Judge Olivia Parker, told me what happened in that courtroom. She told me how you've carried the weight of the past for so long, thinking you were forgotten. But you weren't. Not to me. Not to any of us who survived because of you." Mason's chest tightened as he read, the words from Jack's letter echoing in his mind. It was the closure he had never thought he would find. In that moment, the years of struggle, the nights spent cold and alone, seemed to fall away. The letter went on to talk about the man Mason had been before the war and after. It spoke of bravery, of sacrifice, and of honor, all qualities that Mason had carried with him, even when he thought no one was watching. "You saved me, Mason," Jack's letter continued. "You gave me a chance to come home, to live, and I'm sorry I couldn't return the favor. But know that I've never forgotten. And my sister, she'll make sure your story is never forgotten either." Mason sat down slowly, the letter clutched in his hands. The room around him seemed to blur as he processed the weight of the words. He had always wondered if the sacrifice had been worth it. He had questioned his decisions, the choices he made, and whether anyone would remember. But now he knew that someone had. Judge Parker had carried her brother's memory, just as Mason had carried the memory of his comrades. In some strange, powerful way, their stories had intertwined, bringing them together in this moment of recognition. Mason stood up and walked over to the small window in his new apartment. The city stretched out before him, and for the first time in years, he could see the horizon. He wasn't alone anymore, and he wasn't forgotten. The VA benefits had been restored, and with them came a sense of stability he hadn't felt in a long time. Full medical coverage, housing allowance, disability pay. For the first time, Mason could see the road ahead, and it wasn't filled with the darkness of uncertainty. The future seemed possible again. But it wasn't just about the material benefits, the financial stability, or even the recognition of his service. What mattered more than anything was the chance to rebuild. Mason wasn't just starting a new chapter of his life. He was rewriting his story, and it was a story he was proud of. It was a story that spoke of sacrifice, of honor, and of resilience. Mason knew that this wasn't the end of his journey, but rather the beginning. The road to healing would be long, and there would be days when the weight of the past would threaten to pull him back. But he had learned something important over the last few days. He had learned that it wasn't the past that defined him, but what he chose to do with the present. The future was his to create. And so Mason Quinn stood taller than he had in years, not as a forgotten veteran, but as a man reborn. His story had been heard, his life mattered, and he would move forward, one step at a time, with his head held high. If you've been moved by Mason's journey, his courage, and his resilience, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories like his, stories of struggle, strength, and triumph. By subscribing, you'll be part of a community that believes in second chances and the power of acknowledgement. Remember, no one is truly forgotten, and every story deserves to be heard. Thank you for joining us in celebrating Mason's new chapter. Let's continue to honor those who have fought, sacrificed, and persevered. Together, we can make sure their stories are never lost.